Hey, what it doing everybody? It's your boy Papa Stevia. Today I've got a review of Lost in Vivo for you. Now please take note that this is the first ever review I've made, and it's only the second time that I've tried voiceover work. So be gentle when you're eventually gonna flame me in the comments. Yeah, alright. Any man's beat me to it. Bastard. So, over the most recent years, the AAA publishers have mostly pulled out of the horror genre, meaning you now have to look into the dark realm of indie games to find anything that just remotely resembles what was being released previously. So, regarding these indie games, while some of them pose great potential, an unfortunate trope that they tend to have is that they rely far too heavily on the cheaper elements of horror, such as jump scares and chase sequences, to a point where it feels almost like the game forces these things upon you rather than them playing into the story and feeling more natural. Unfortunately though, as with the movies, these tropes also occur in AAA games now, especially in the walking simulators. So should you find yourself trying out something like Outlast, you can expect to be jumped like it's Detroit in 1995.
Hi there, would you like to sign a petition?
Friggin' bullshit.
In the original Outlast's defense though, while it did do a couple things wrong, it also did a couple things right. While it certainly relied far too much on the random jump scares and unnecessary chase sequences, in my opinion, it also did manage to pull off a lot of spooky effect with the environment, which is what I like to see. But the main issue with using enemy placement as the scary part is that, well, you have to sneak around an enemy, yeah, but how's that any different than sneaking around a juggernaut in Watch Dogs or in Splinter Cell? With the exception that you obviously can't take them down in a walking simulator. But in the case of Outlast and also some other cases, the enemies are triggered to your location even if you manage to sneak around them completely. Unlike in an actual stealth game, where the enemy would still be completely oblivious to you when you sneak around them. I suppose the developers do this to force a chase sequence instead of just letting you completely in stealth like you do in a proper stealth game, because where would the spooky part in that be, other than the fact that you have a fucking menacing enemy that would maybe trigger if you actually walk into its field of view, but of course it has to trigger anyway, because they just have to have that chase sequence, yeah. That said though, Lost in Vivo isn't entirely free of those either. Now I said that like it's a bad thing, but it really isn't, because Lost in Vivo uses it in moderation, and as far as I can remember there is only, well, less than you can count on one hand regarding jump scares and chase sequences. And as far as I recall, there's 0 sequences where you have to sneak around. So, just before we get into the actual review, Lost in Vivo is made by a chap called Akuma Kira, and I believe he made the entire game himself, whereas his previous game, Spooky's Jump Scare Mansion, he directed as part of a team. And also it's available for only €10 on Steam, so there's really no reason not to get it. The premise of the game is that you play as a person who suffers from a severe
and continuous lapse in my judgment.
Well, yes, but it actually starts with a bad case of claustrophobia. So your therapist suggests that you try in vivo exposure therapy. So you're taken to a scene where you're out walking with your therapy dog, which gets swallowed by a storm drain. And as the complete and utter madman you are, you jump right in after it. Or not, as the game lets you crawl right back out after you jump in. How's that for an alternate Far Cry ending, you lazy fuck? At least I didn't have to wait 15 minutes for this shit. So if you should choose adversity over avoidance, You will now find yourself in what the game calls the confines of the sewer. And as you begin to trek through the sewers, your grip on reality starts to slip more and more, and you start to question everything around you. Is this even real? How does this make any sense? You stumble upon more and more hideously deformed creatures that shouldn't even be able to exist, yet somehow still do. Many of them have this brown or blood red color palette that either suggests necrosis or the skin has been turned inside out, writhing and shrieking in agony, which is also seen in the way that they shamble towards you. You drag yourself through sewers and subways, tunnels and mines, with this blaring soundtrack in your ears and unrelenting enemies that pursue you no matter where you go. And as you feel the walls closing in around you, you ask yourself, how much more of this do I have to endure? Shambling along your path, you see a familiar sight. A blue door. A safe room. You get a breather, a brief moment of respite, while listening to the sweet hum of the melody that plays within it, before hopping right back into the onslaught. Every time you come upon a new door, you question what is behind it. You question what's behind the next corner. I appreciate it when a game is able to make me feel threatened, without making me feel like a sitting duck. It's quite clear with this game that it takes hints from the original Silent Hill games, in the sense that when the game starts off, it looks all man-made and industrial, and the further you progress into the game, the more dilapidated the environment starts to look. The structures start to shift out of proportion, impossibly so, but at the same time you come across these oddly mundane locations that seem completely misplaced in their respective environments, making you question whether or not you have even moved from the original spot you were in, if this is all taking place within your head. Wait a minute, didn't I read this exact note 3 hours ago? What is real and what isn't? This is probably my favorite way to go about both video games as well as movies. The psychological horror, without restraints or limitations, where anything is possible. As with the terrain's design, the textures and animations also seem to bear a resemblance of old PlayStation 1 games, but while retaining some modern aspects like the beautiful lighting, decent VFX and particles, smoothed edges, and a surprisingly good amount of detail. As well as that, I'm pretty sure it also runs on, well, pretty much any Windows computer you can find, as well as in Windows emulators on Linux and Mac. But probably the largest driving force of this game is its impeccable soundtrack, which you have already been hearing a bit of throughout this video. It alternates between anything from, normal music, and the ambient noise you hear throughout the game that just grinds on your eardrums. So while the game is quite reminiscent of Silent Hill, it's never to the point where it's just copying it. It's Akumakira's own take on some of the elements of Silent Hill. Just as I'd say if I could make money off the video UMG claimed after I used a little bit of Rolling Stones in it. So, regarding the mechanics, they are pretty good. Not so good that it requires some better AI from the game side, or so bad that it makes the game artificially difficult. The first weapon you'll be picking up is a sledgehammer, which you swing surprisingly quickly for a sledgehammer. But regardless, you won't be using it that much because melee in this game can be a bit tricky because you can't dodge in the normal mode, and hacking at enemies isn't going to stagger them like it does in Dark Souls.
Miyazaki.
Explain!
So you'll have to know the correct timing for blocking, which gets particularly tricky with enemies that neither have visual or audio cues. Most of the time it's pretty random. I wasn't able to figure it out myself, but I didn't try that hard because, well, there was the gunplay. The second melee weapon you find is a kitchen knife that looks like the knife from Silent Hill 1 or 2, and it's basically a faster sledgehammer. Right, back to the gunplay because right, boy, that's where the fun is at.
Are you kidding me?
So, if you play a little bit around with it or do the boring thing and read the item description, you'll come to realize it's nothing more than a salt dispenser whose only purpose is to pump the enemies so full of salt that they rage quit the game. So yeah, basically it only works on softer targets. Onto the primary assault weapon of this game, the pistol, or damaged handgun as it's actually called. It's based on a Ruger Mark IV, I believe, and the Ruger Mark IV is chambered in .22. And lo and behold, it also does the damage you'd actually expect from a .22. So, as long as you hit the head or other weak spots, it'll take anything down within 5 shots, with most enemies going down with as little as 1 to 2 shots. Only downside though, seeing as it's damaged, is that it'll jam sometimes, but just press the button again after it jams and it shoots, so this isn't a problem when spamming away. So yeah, in conclusion, the firearms aren't perfect, but they're certainly a lot easier to use than the melee weapons, and there's also a decent amount of ammo lying around. As for the enemies, well, I'd say the host of enemies is pretty diverse, which I certainly like. There's a nice variety in enemy types and the way they operate. For instance, you have normal enemies that sometimes come in groups, and sometimes don't. Enemies that respawn or are simply too angry to die. Meaning, sometimes you'll have to take down a group of enemies, or in other situations, you'll have to repeatedly take down an enemy until you've completed your objective in that area. Also, there are a few enemies, I suppose you can call them boss fights, where you can't harm the enemy directly, but you have to do something to harm them, or they're just flat out immortal. So yeah, pro tip. Read the papers you find lying around and take the information to heart. Unless it's complete Looney Tunes, then you don't need to worry too much about it. Because otherwise you might end up running in circles, until you ultimately end up breaking the initiation vow of the pro gamers, and actually look up the solution. Oh yes, and never to forget the annoying enemies.
Release the brainstorm to make the motherfucking brain warm.
Boy. Damn, boy, he's thick. Boy, that's a thick ass boy. Damn.
Right, so how does the game feel? Well, it's kind of like the older Batman games where the only way to beat on people is to jump from one guy to another, as you can't do quicker takedowns than that. But this time it's mostly you receiving the beating, so every time the game has knocked you down, it kind of forgets about you, and a little while later it realizes you haven't had a near heart attack in 3 nanoseconds, and so it sends another beating your way. But don't worry too much, it's not like it hammers you in the head with a sign that says "I'm a horror game" every 5 seconds, while screaming at you like some lunatic.
That's gonna be sore tomorrow.
But seriously, which pocket reality do these motherfuckers keep jumping out from? Back on topic, I found Lost in Vivo to go about this issue quite professionally, respectfully, and realistically. The important takeaway here is the brief moments of respite that the game gives you. This is one of the contributing factors that make this game so good. It doesn't grind you into the dirt repeatedly and just expect you to carry on. It knows you can't just roll with the punches forever, so it gives you moments to pick yourself up again, and perhaps it gives you a new clip of ammunition, or maybe you get a new save zone. So that's the way that the game can keep you playing rather than burning you out prematurely. Now, moving up on the last section. Here I'll be talking a little bit about the replayability and the secrets in the game. So starting up with the replayability, when you finish the game you get the option to launch it in New Game Plus and continue on from there. Now, unlike other games, this game doesn't increase in difficulty per se. It does add a couple more enemies and a few new enemy types. Damn, that bat's gotta be strong. Jeez. However, since this game is so well constructed, it still manages to spook me even on New Game Plus 3, which is quite an achievement, because I usually have most, if not an entire game memorized once I get around to New Game Plus. Now, another thing you unlock when you go to New Game Plus is different skins for the different weapons. Starting off with the sledgehammer, you now have an alternative sledgehammer skin and a hammer axe combo from, I believe, Spooky's Mansion, as well as a fireman's axe. For the kitchen knife, there's a commando knife and the knife from Spooky's Mansion. In case you're wondering what Spooky's Mansion is, it's basically the previous game that Akuma Kira was working on. As for the pistol, there's unfortunately not a new skin for that. However, there is another skin for the shotgun, which is a double barrel shotgun. Now, this is probably my favorite and possibly also the most significant skin in the game, because it means that you are now limited to only 2 shots rather than 7, but you can fire in rapid succession and load in rapid succession. And you know, maybe I'm just telling myself this, but it does feel like it does more damage. But whether or not that's actually the case, I don't know. As for the melee weapons, well, I usually don't use them, but the ones I have tried are the spooky skins, and while they do attack significantly quicker than their normal counterparts, it does also feel like they do a bit less damage, so be aware of that when you try them out. So in case you want to optimize after which skins do the best job at taking down enemies, I suggest you hop over to the Lost in Vivo Discord server, where I'm sure they'll have either some stats on the weapons or people who are more than willing to discuss it with you. I'll leave a link in the description for it. Moving on to the secret modes. If you open the game at midnight, it should open up into the midnight menu, or the midnight mode if you want to call it that. If it doesn't do it right away, just let it sit and idle until it plays the animation video, and then you can just tap any button and it'll launch into the midnight menu. The gameplay feels like it has been influenced a lot by games like Castlevania and also 90s shooting games like Doom, with the handling characteristics and the increased movement speed. And this is further amplified by the most magnificent retrowave soundtrack you can imagine. The objective of the midnight mode is to collect 30 coins so you can face the big boss, Shoggoth. What a monstrosity of a homage Kira turned his pet into. Or, after collecting the coins, you can ring the bell like 40 times like some madman and face a mirage of the big bad from the main game. Which incidentally also has a far cooler soundtrack than that of the main boss. Another cool little thing you get in the midnight mode is the ability to dodge, so you might want to abuse the shit out of that before you actually try blocking, because that's the other way you can avoid taking damage, and trust me, you're gonna take a lot of damage the first 2 runs. The next secret mode is the dark mode that you get by lowering the gamma to minimum and pressing continue or a new game. This takes you to a 15 to 20 minute sequence where you drive in your car, and it gives us a lot of backstory to the character, specifically the claustrophobia element. As you drive through the tunnels on the way home, your claustrophobia gets worse and worse, and you begin to hallucinate. Bro, that was some seriously bad LSD. The final hidden mode is the light mode, or red mode. You get by, you guessed it, upping the gamma to maximum and launching the game. This results in you being put in what is called the Gallery of Light. The Gallery of Light is basically just a gallery of all the enemies in the game put in their respective environment with the background. You can also find characters here from the hidden modes, like Midnight mode and the Dark mode, as well as the newly added videotapes, I suppose, called the Mercer's tapes. And of course, the entities that you find in the lost tapes from the main game. Speaking of those lost tapes, throughout the game you find these cassette tapes that you can play in cassette players that are usually located close to save rooms. Playing these tapes will put you into a little bizarre and twisted dream sequence where I believe some of them are the character's own corrupted memories. Although Kira has went out and said that the tapes aren't canon to the story, which I happen to find a bit odd, as you go and pick up your dog in the first one. Now, onto something new. Kira recently added 2 more tapes, but unlike the tapes that you find out throughout the main story, these are, well, I suppose you can call them VHS tapes instead of cassette tapes, because they are their own little mini stories. I haven't played them yet, but I will be making videos of them on the channel later. Interestingly about the second one, it isn't written by Kira himself. It is actually written by a chap called Mr. Craven on YouTube. And he also happens to be the owner of the dog that the in-game dog was modeled after. So, regarding the endings, I won't be disclosing any other endings than the one I've already shown in the video, being the pseudo Far Cry ending. There are 3 more endings, 2 of which are secrets. So if you want to know those, you'll have to play the game yourself. or just look it up on the wiki. Coming close to the end here, I'd like to use this moment to thank Akuma Kira and Mr. Craven, as well as all the people backing the game on Kickstarter. It was truly a magnificent game. Thank you so much for making this a reality. Right, so I think that'll do for now. I hope you enjoyed the video and perhaps learned something. I know I certainly did, about cinematography and voiceover, which I'll certainly be improving on. This is quite a step up from my usual content, so I am happy to finally publish this, as well as I'm happy to announce that I'll be making more content like this in the future. And thanks for staying with me through this very long time it took me to make this video, and I hope I convinced you as to why you should play this game. If you can leave me some feedback on it, that would be massively appreciated. So, with all that said, goodbye for now. Just kidding, here's a final joke. You see that cat there in the safe room? Don't shoot him, man. Don't do it, man. It's basically Kira and his... So, as I was just about to say before I was so rudely interrupted, was that this is basically Kira manifesting himself in the game as some god creature, taking the shape of a cute little three-eyed cat. But yeah, goodbye, for real this time.